Two tales, each unfolding under California's vast skies, yet worlds apart in the horror they contain. The first leads us into the dark heart of Northern California's ancient Redwoods, where something terrifying and primal stalks unwary wanderers through the towering trees. Then, far to the south, the relentless desert sun sets the stage for an encounter with a mutated clan of deformed predators who skulk among abandoned military roads. Both stories reveal secrets best left undisturbed, and both confront us with a single haunting truth. Sometimes, the shadows hold more than mere darkness. Step into the abyss, and welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and join our ever-growing community of the curious. Your support is the lifeblood that keeps this channel alive. Now, prepare yourself, for what you're about to witness is not for the faint of heart. A couple of weeks ago, although it feels like months in my mind, my friend Carter and I decided to take a weekend trip through the Redwood National and State Parks in Northern California. We both needed a break from city stress, and we'd been fascinated for a long time by stories of strange happenings in the deep forests near the Klamath River. Little did we know that whatever was lurking among those colossal trees was far beyond anything we could have expected. I should mention first that we'd done our homework. We read up on local trail conditions and planned to hike through the popular sites at Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park, then maybe head down to Prairie Creek Redwoods if time allowed. We started hearing odd rumors from a woman at a small grocery in Orick when we stocked up on supplies. According to her, there'd been talk of missing hikers off-trail. People chalk it up to folks getting lost or local wildlife, but she mentioned seeing something unnatural lurking in the forest. She didn't want to elaborate. She merely told us to stick to the marked paths, especially at dusk. That's when I started feeling uneasy, but Carter brushed it off. On the first day, things went as planned. Spectacular views of those ancient trees towering overhead like silent giants. We set up camp at Mill Creek Campground that night. The place was quiet, no rustling of squirrels, birds, or anything else you'd expect in a typical forest environment at night. Even though the redwood groves often have that muffled kind of silence, this felt like everything had retreated into hiding. I mentioned it to Carter in a roundabout way, and he simply suggested we get an early start in the morning, maybe see some wildlife then. But that night, I had trouble sleeping. There was this subtle feeling, like something was pacing the perimeter of our campsite. No footsteps or twigs snapping, just more like the atmosphere itself was shifting, a sense of a presence. I recall drifting in and out, getting glimpses of faint silhouettes against the moonlight whenever I found the courage to peek out of my tent flap. At one point, I was sure I glimpsed a tall figure taller than any person I'd seen standing between two giant redwoods. It was so thin it almost blended with the trunk, but every time I blinked, it seemed gone. We woke at dawn, packed up, and pressed onward. The second day is when everything turned from a mild sense of unease into something truly nightmarish. We took a lesser-known path that branched off from the main trail toward an area known for its thick understory and rough terrain. It was around midday when Carter mentioned something was trailing us. He kept glancing back, saying there was an occasional rustle in the underbrush. Normally, I would have assumed it was a deer or maybe a stray elk, but the slight glimpses we caught, just fleeting shapes from the corner of an eye, seemed oddly humanoid. It felt like we were heading into territory that humans weren't meant to tread. The trees were so massive they blocked out the sun, and the deeper we went, the quieter it got. That in itself was bizarre. No distant bird calls, no scurrying chipmunks, just a heavy emptiness. We came upon a clearing near the Klamath River. The water rushed softly nearby. That's when everything escalated. We saw deep claw-like marks on a tree trunk, too high to be made by any normal creature. They were spaced in a way that suggested a hand or paw larger than our own by a good margin. A sense of dread pooled in my stomach, and I remember Carter muttering he'd never seen anything like that. Then we noticed an odd stench, almost like decaying flesh mixed with damp moss. It wafted in on the breeze, strong enough to make my eyes water. We both froze, scanning the edges of the clearing. That's when I saw it. The figure stood maybe 30 feet away, partially hidden behind the twisted remains of a fallen redwood. It was tall, probably over 7 feet, with elongated limbs and a hunched back. Its skin, if you could call it that, looked stretched tight over a gaunt frame, almost grayish, and it had these twisted antler-like protrusions on its head. That's when the word Wendigo popped into my mind, something we'd heard from local legends, but I always thought those were mainly stories from the North Woods and Great Lakes region. Yet this thing was right there, in front of us, in the redwood forest. We locked eyes, or rather, it fixed its eyes on us. They seemed sunken, but had this faint glow, like embers burning in a dying fire, but still enough to send chills through every part of me. It was as if it was staring straight into my core, reading my thoughts. Carter's breathing became ragged, and I realized I'd been holding mine. I felt a primal terror welling up, like the kind of fear that tells you you've wandered into the domain of a predator that sees you as prey. Without any overt movement, I felt it shift its attention from me to Carter, as though it was choosing which of us to approach first. And this was the most horrifying part. It slowly tilted its head, almost like it was curious or mocking us. Everything in me screamed to run, but I couldn't move. My legs were locked in place, adrenaline spiking so hard my heart thundered in my ears. Carter finally managed to break free from that paralysis and gestured for me to move back toward the path. As we started to inch away, the creature let out a sound that was unlike anything I'd ever heard, like a raspy exhalation crossed with a pained moan, if you can even imagine that. It hit me so hard I stumbled and nearly fell. Carter pulled me up and we bolted. We didn't see exactly which direction it moved, but I swear it was stalking us on a parallel course. Every so often we'd catch a glimpse of that horrifying shape weaving through the trunks, disappearing and reappearing. At one point, we found ourselves disoriented. No cell signal, no marked trail to rely on. We wandered for what felt like hours, with the dreadful certainty that we were being toyed with. Occasionally, we'd catch the stench again, the same rotting odor, alerting us that the creature might be just out of view. My mind jumped to all the stories we'd read about unexplainable vanishings and remains found scattered in remote areas. It was a living nightmare. Eventually, by sheer luck, we emerged onto a well-worn path near Boy Scout tree trail. We saw a couple of other hikers in the distance. They waved to us casually, but must have noticed our ashen faces and the terror in our eyes because they hurried over. Carter tried to explain something was chasing us, though he never used the word Wendigo. He just described a tall, antlered creature with a stench. The hikers looked concerned, but also confused. We stayed with them until we reached the trailhead parking area, not daring to look back. Even now, I keep replaying that stare in my mind. Those burning, hollow eyes, the feeling it projected. It was like raw hunger and ancient malevolence rolled into one. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a diseased elk or some other bizarre anomaly. But that doesn't explain the humanoid outline, the elongated limbs, that impossible sense of intelligence in its gaze. Carter and I are still shaken. We've told a few people, close friends mostly, and most just think we misidentified a known animal under stress or panic. But Carter swears, and I agree, that we both saw something that defies logical explanation, something that shouldn't exist in those ancient redwood groves, or anywhere for that matter. I'm sharing this now for your YouTube channel, because I believe folks should know that just because something seems tied to a certain region or is labeled as a myth, it doesn't mean it can't show up in unexpected places. We might never have the full story, but I can tell you this. Those deep, silent redwood forests hold more secrets than we'd like to believe. Take this for what it's worth. I can't force anyone to believe what Carter and I experienced, but I do hope you keep your eyes open if you ever find yourselves wandering off the beaten path in Northern California's ancient woods. Even the mightiest trees can't protect you from what lurks in their shadows. Tales of creatures beyond explanation have fueled our imaginations for centuries, and yet, sometimes, the imagination isn't so far from the truth. This next story takes place in the vast emptiness of the Mojave Desert. Two travelers find more than scorching sun and endless sand. Something with twisted faces and ravenous intent lurks in the shadows of abandoned military roads. An encounter that begins as a curious detour and transforms into a desperate fight for survival. I still can't wrap my head around what we went through near the Mojave Desert. My cousin Willow and I had been planning a road trip through some lesser-known corners of California, mostly because we're big fans of weird roadside attractions and abandoned places. We'd heard about the old mining towns scattered around Interstate 15, near places like Calico Ghost Town, but we wanted something less touristy, somewhere we could poke around without crowds. It was after chatting with a local mechanic near Barstow that we got the idea to check out these remote desert roads heading toward Death Valley, specifically an area near a forgotten military testing site that no one seemed keen on talking about. He mentioned that people sometimes saw flickers of light in the distance at night, but he shrugged it off as old munitions or strange local legends. That didn't faze us, so we stocked up on water and snacks, and off we went. It's hard to describe that sense of isolation you get once you go off the main highway. The desert stretches out in all directions, and it can feel like you're the last people on Earth. We were halfway between Afton Canyon and some random dusty junction when we realized we were running low on gas, which was dumb on our part, but we assumed we'd stumble on a station sooner or later. By the time we noticed we were basically driving on fumes, the sun was setting. We spotted an old service road that branched off from the main route, and it looked like there might be structures in the distance. So we figured we'd turn off and see if maybe we could find help or at least a place to park safely for the night. We drove along that dirt path under a moonlit sky, each bump making Willow more anxious. The structures we saw turned out to be mostly decrepit sheds or abandoned shacks. The wind was picking up a bit, whipping sand across our headlights. That's when I noticed footprints along the edge of the road. Bare human footprints in the desert, which gave me an uneasy feeling, especially because they looked fresh. We tried to ignore it, telling ourselves maybe it was a hiker or a prospector, though that was unlikely given the time of day and how remote it was. We finally gave in and stopped near this rickety shack that had a collapsed roof. We climbed out, flashlights in hand, to see if there was anything salvageable or if maybe someone was inside. The door was missing, just a twisted frame. Inside, we found some old cans, a broken cot, and bones. Animal bones, I told myself. It was better to think they were animal, though the shape made me uneasy. Willow was just about ready to go back to the car when we heard the first scuttling sound from outside, like somebody scraping across the sand. It was faint, but unmistakable. We peeked around the corner and saw movement out by some boulders maybe 30 yards away. The flashlight beam caught a shape that darted backward, out of sight, faster than anyone should be able to move. That was the moment my hair stood on end because it felt like we weren't alone, and it wasn't just one person. There was a sense that multiple eyes were on us. We rushed back to the car, realized our tank was practically empty, and decided to lock ourselves inside for the night, hoping daybreak would offer some clarity. Sometime after midnight, we woke to tapping on the windshield. I refused to turn on the headlights. I was too terrified. Instead, we just sat in the darkness, listening. Then the tapping got louder, and Willow quietly turned the key, just enough to power the interior lights. In that dim glow, we saw a face peering in through the driver's side window. Calling it a face might be generous. This individual's skin was blotchy, almost raw, and you could see a strange, tumor-like growth above one eyebrow. The eyes were set too wide, almost as though they'd migrated further apart. I had this awful sensation that we were looking at someone who'd been exposed to radiation or some extreme chemical. The figure just stared at us, mouth slightly open, and we could see dirty teeth, filed or chipped into jagged points. Right about then, we heard another noise outside Willow's window. We turned our heads to see a second figure. This one had an elongated neck, and part of its arm looked shriveled, like it hadn't developed properly. It held a rusted metal rod in the good hand, tapping on the glass. There was a hungry or predatory look in its eyes, if you can call that expression something that a human face could manage. We were both trembling. Suddenly, the first one, the wide-eyed one, disappeared from the window, and we heard rummaging noises near the trunk. That's when we realized there might be more of them out there. We had no choice but to hope they wouldn't break the windows and drag us out. The whole car smelled like sweat and fear. We made a plan. At first light, try to push the car as far as it would go, or maybe find a way to siphon leftover gas from any old vehicles near the shacks. But in the middle of these frantic thoughts, we heard what sounded like a guttural moan from behind the car. That's when the third one came into view, if you can even call it that. This one was squat but built solid, with lumps all along its spine, visible through torn clothing. Its face seemed partially melted on one side, with teeth permanently exposed where the cheek should have been. It was carrying what looked like a piece of rotten meat in its hand, raising it to its mouth in a slow, horrifying motion. We realized in that moment these might be scavengers, possibly cannibalistic. I felt nauseated. It was like being caught in a nightmare. The three of them circled around the vehicle for hours, occasionally disappearing behind boulders or crates, then popping up at the edges of the windows. We tried not to make noise. The tension was unbearable. At one point, the wide-eyed individual crawled onto the hood, pressing its face against the windshield. I caught a glimpse of filth-encrusted fingernails scratching the glass. Willow fought the urge to scream, covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. I remember thinking we might not survive till morning. Eventually, daybreak came. The sky lightened, and in that hazy early dawn, we saw them scatter like cockroaches, slipping back behind the rocks. Before we mustered the courage to move, we heard distant shouts. To our shock, it sounded like more of them, deeper in the desert. We debated whether to try to drive further or risk leaving on foot to find help. Our car sputtered for about half a mile before giving out completely. We found ourselves stranded on foot, scanning the dusty horizon for any sign of a road or a ranch or anything that resembled safety. It was nearly an hour later, parched and exhausted, that we saw an old pickup truck bouncing along a worn path. We flagged it down. The driver was an older man who looked bewildered at our condition. We tried to explain about the mutated people, the ones that practically hunted us during the night. He muttered something about a rumored off-limits area from military testing decades ago, hinting that you hear stories of families squatting in old bunkers, suffering genetic damage from radiation. He didn't want to hang around, so he gave us a lift back to Barstow, dropping us off at a gas station and telling us to stay away from those restricted areas if we valued our lives. I've told a few others about it, but most chalk it up to delirium or some elaborate hoax. However, I can't forget the image of that face pressed against the windshield, the lumps on that squat figure's spine, or the reek of decay in the night air. My cousin won't even speak about it anymore. She just avoids the subject entirely. I'm sharing this account because I genuinely think people need to know that there are places in our deserts where you could stumble upon unspeakable horrors, things that might once have been human but now barely resemble it. Those old nuclear or chemical test sites have a dark legacy. No matter how many times they're declared safe, things can lurk out there, maybe half dead, half insane. Definitely dangerous. If anyone's planning to go off the beaten path in the Mojave or near any other forgotten desert wasteland in Southern California, don't assume you're alone, and don't assume everything out there is just harmless wildlife. In the quiet of dawn, the desert reveals its secrets, or buries them beneath shifting sands. For those unlucky enough to see what lurks in the midnight gloom, the question remains: just what is waiting out there, eager to greet the next unwary visitor? And so, another strange encounter fades away. A trick of the mind, or something far more unsettling. That's for you to decide. Thank you so much for watching my stories. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support is what keeps this channel going.